When economists tell you inflation is necessary for economic growth, or that it can be controlled through sophisticated monetary policy, they reveal a fundamental misunderstanding of what inflation actually is. They treat symptoms while ignoring the disease, measure effects while denying the cause, and propose solutions that inevitably worsen the very problems they claim to solve. The truth about inflation isn't complicated, it's simply inconvenient for those who benefit from monetary manipulation. After witnessing the hyperinflation that destroyed Austria in the 1920s and observing decades of American monetary policy mistakes, I can demonstrate why every mainstream theory of inflation fails at its logical foundation. Inflation isn't a mysterious economic phenomenon requiring complex mathematical models. It's the inevitable result of increasing the money supply beyond the voluntary demands of market participants. Every other explanation, from demand pull to cost push theories, represents intellectual confusion that serves political ends rather than economic understanding. Today, we'll examine why praxeological analysis reveals the true nature of inflation while mainstream economics perpetuates dangerous myths that enable continued monetary destruction of American prosperity. Chapter 1: The Fatal Confusion about what inflation actually is. Before we can understand why economists consistently err about inflation, we must establish what inflation actually is, and what it categorically is not. The modern confusion begins with a fundamental definitional error that pervades all mainstream economic analysis. Inflation is not rising prices. This bears repeating because the entire edifice of contemporary monetary theory rests on this false foundation. Rising prices are a consequence of inflation, not inflation itself. When economists define inflation as a general increase in price levels, they commit the same logical error as defining fever as the thermometer reading rather than the underlying infection. True inflation consists of increasing the money supply beyond what market participants voluntarily demand for their cash holdings. When central banks create new money, whether through printing currency, expanding bank reserves, or purchasing government bonds, they inject additional purchasing power into the economy without any corresponding increase in goods and services. This artificial expansion of money necessarily disturbs the natural relationship between supply and demand for all economic goods. Consider what happens when the Federal Reserve creates $1 billion new dollars. This money doesn't appear uniformly in everyone's wallet. It enters the economy at specific points, through government spending, bank lending, or asset purchases, and spreads throughout the economic system through successive transactions. The first recipients can purchase goods at existing prices, but as this new money circulates, it necessarily drives up demand for limited goods, causing prices to rise. The Austrian understanding recognizes that this process involves more than simple price increases. The new money distorts the entire structure of relative prices, sending false signals throughout the economy about consumer preferences, resource scarcity, and investment opportunities. When the Federal Reserve lowers interest rates artificially by expanding credit, entrepreneurs receive signals suggesting that consumers are saving more and demanding fewer present goods. Acting on this false information, they begin long-term investment projects that appear profitable only because of the artificially cheap credit. This explains why Austrian economists correctly predicted the 2008 housing crisis while mainstream economists remained optimistic about sustainable growth. The housing boom resulted directly from Federal Reserve policies that expanded mortgage credit far beyond what voluntary savings could support. Mainstream economists saw rising house prices as evidence of economic health, but praxeological analysis revealed these price increases as symptoms of monetary distortion that made the subsequent crash inevitable. The consequences extend beyond immediate price effects. Inflation necessarily redistributes wealth from those who receive the new money last to those who receive it first. Government officials, banks, and large corporations benefit from spending new money at old prices, while wage earners and savers suffer as prices rise before their incomes adjust. This isn't an accidental side effect, it's a logical necessity of the inflationary process. When economists focus exclusively on price indices, they miss these fundamental redistributive effects and the systematic economic distortions that inflation creates. They measure symptoms while ignoring causes, treating inflation as if it were a natural economic phenomenon rather than the predictable result of deliberate monetary policy choices. Chapter 2: Why Mainstream Theories Fail at Basic Logic. Every mainstream theory of inflation fails because it attempts to explain effects while ignoring their necessary cause. These theories represent not scientific analysis but intellectual constructions designed to obscure the simple truth that inflation results from monetary expansion by central authorities. The demand-pull theory claims inflation occurs when aggregate demand exceeds aggregate supply. This explanation commits a fundamental logical error by treating aggregate demand as if it were a meaningful economic category. In reality, there is no such thing as aggregate demand, only the specific demands of individual actors for particular goods at definite prices. When economists speak of demand exceeding supply in general, they employ a conceptual abstraction that has no counterpart in economic reality. Moreover, this theory cannot explain why increased demand for goods would necessarily lead to rising prices rather than increased production. If consumers suddenly demanded more automobiles, why wouldn't automobile manufacturers simply produce more cars rather than raising prices? The demand-pull theorists have no logical answer because their theory ignores the role of money in economic calculation. The cost-push theory fares no better, claiming that inflation results from rising production costs. This theory fails immediately when we ask, rising costs in terms of what? If labor costs rise, this could reflect increased productivity justifying higher wages, or it could reflect currency depreciation making money wages less valuable. The theory provides no mechanism for distinguishing between these radically different phenomena. Furthermore, cost-push theory cannot explain how rising costs for some goods would cause a general increase in all prices. If steel becomes more expensive, producers of steel-intensive goods might raise their prices, but this should make other goods relatively cheaper, attracting consumer spending away from steel-intensive products. Only an increase in the money supply can cause all prices to rise simultaneously. Keynesian theories compound these errors by treating inflation as potentially beneficial for economic growth. They argue that moderate inflation can stimulate economic activity by encouraging spending over saving. This analysis reveals a complete misunderstanding of how economic progress actually occurs. Economic growth results from saving, investment, and capital accumulation, precisely the activities that inflation discourages. When people expect their money to lose value, they have every incentive to spend immediately rather than save for future investment. This apparent stimulus of current consumption comes at the cost of reduced capital formation, making society poorer in the long run. The Keynesian focus on achieving full employment through inflation demonstrates another logical fallacy. They assume that creating artificial demand through monetary expansion can somehow create real employment opportunities. But employment becomes sustainable only when it produces goods that consumers actually value enough to purchase voluntarily. Inflation-induced employment creates the appearance of prosperity while actually misallocating labor toward projects that cannot survive without continued monetary stimulus. Monetarist theories, while recognizing the connection between money supply and prices, still fail to understand the mechanism through which this relationship operates. Milton Friedman's famous assertion that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon states a correct conclusion but provides no understanding of the logical process involved. Monetarists treat the relationship between money and prices as if it were a mechanical, mathematical relationship describable through statistical correlations. They miss the crucial insight that inflation affects different people and different goods at different times and in different proportions. The effects depend entirely on how and where the new money enters the economy, the subjective valuations of economic actors, and the specific market conditions existing when monetary expansion occurs. This mechanical approach leads monetarists to believe they can control inflation through precise monetary policy rules. But economic phenomena cannot be controlled like engineering problems because they involve human action, choice, and subjective valuation. Every attempt to fine-tune monetary policy based on statistical relationships fails because it ignores the logical structure of human action that determines how people respond to changed monetary conditions. Chapter 3: The Praxeological Truth About Money and Prices. Understanding inflation requires grasping the praxeological foundations of monetary theory, how money emerges from human action and how its value relates to the subjective preferences of acting individuals. Only through this logical analysis can we comprehend why monetary expansion necessarily disturbs economic coordination. Money didn't originate through government decree or social contract. It emerged spontaneously from market processes as individuals sought to overcome the limitations of direct barter. When people discovered that certain goods, gold, silver, or other durable commodities, were more readily accepted in exchange, these goods gradually became media of exchange through countless individual decisions. The crucial insight is that money's value, like the value of all economic goods, depends entirely on the subjective valuations of individuals who demand it. People value money not for its own sake but for its purchasing power, its ability to acquire other goods and services. This purchasing power reflects the intersection of money supply with the subjective demands of all market participants. When central banks increase the money supply, they necessarily alter this delicate balance. The new money doesn't change everyone's preferences simultaneously or proportionally. It enters the economy through specific channels and affects different people at different times, creating a complex pattern of economic disturbance that unfolds through market processes. Consider what happens when the Federal Reserve purchases government bonds with newly created money. The government receives immediate purchasing power, allowing it to bid for goods and services at existing prices. Government contractors and employees receive this money next, enabling them to increase their spending before prices adjust. Meanwhile, people on fixed incomes or those who receive the new money last find their purchasing power declining as prices throughout the economy gradually rise. This process involves more than simple redistribution. The changing pattern of spending alters relative prices throughout the economy, sending new signals about consumer preferences and resource allocation. Entrepreneurs observe these price changes and adjust their production plans accordingly, but they cannot distinguish between price changes reflecting genuine shifts in consumer preferences and those resulting from monetary manipulation. Take a moment to observe this in your own experience. Have you noticed how certain sectors seem to boom simultaneously, technology stocks, real estate, or commodities, while others stagnate? These patterns often reflect the specific channels through which new money enters the economy rather than underlying changes in consumer preferences or technological opportunities. The Austrian understanding explains why these boom periods inevitably lead to busts. Monetary expansion creates the illusion of increased consumer demand and business opportunities, leading entrepreneurs to undertake investment projects that appear profitable only because of artificially lowered interest rates and distorted price signals. When the monetary expansion slows or stops, these projects reveal themselves as malinvestments that cannot generate sufficient revenue to justify their costs. This analysis also explains why inflation affects different goods and services unequally. Financial assets typically rise first, as newly created money often flows initially into bond and stock markets. Real estate follows, as investors seek alternatives to financial assets and lower interest rates make property purchases more attractive. consumer goods rise last, as the new money gradually works its way through the economy to final consumption. The mainstream fixation on consumer price indices misses these crucial patterns. By focusing on average price increases for consumer goods, economists ignore the massive distortions occurring in asset markets and investment goods that ultimately determine the economy's productive capacity. Furthermore, the praxeological approach reveals why attempts to measure inflation through statistical aggregates must fail. Human action deals with individual choices about specific goods at particular times and places. No statistical index can capture the complex web of subjective valuations and voluntary exchanges that determine actual economic relationships. When the Bureau of Labor Statistics announces that inflation was 2.1% last month, this figure represents a mathematical abstraction with no counterpart in economic reality. Different people experience different rates of price increase depending on their spending patterns, geographic location, and position in the economic structure. The elderly person on a fixed income faces very different inflation effects than the technology entrepreneur receiving venture capital funding. Chapter 4: How Central Banking Creates the Inflation They Claim to Control. The greatest irony of modern monetary policy lies in central bankers claiming to control the very inflation their institutions necessarily create. The Federal Reserve presents itself as the guardian of price stability while operating the machinery that makes price stability logically impossible. Central banking itself represents a departure from market-based monetary systems. When governments grant monopoly privileges to central banks, they eliminate the natural market controls that would limit money creation to levels consistent with genuine economic demand. In a free market, banks that issued excessive currency or credit would face immediate consequences as customers demanded redemption in gold or other sound money. This market discipline provided automatic limits on monetary expansion. The Federal Reserve System removes these natural constraints by creating a government-sponsored monopoly over money creation. When the Fed expands the money supply, no market mechanism exists to discipline this expansion because competing currencies are legally prohibited. Citizens must accept Federal Reserve notes as legal tender regardless of the Fed's monetary policies. This monopoly position enables central banks to pursue policies that would immediately bankrupt any private institution. When the Fed creates billions of new dollars to purchase government bonds, it pays for these bonds with money that didn't previously exist. Any private entity attempting this would face immediate fraud charges, but central banks operate under special legal privileges that exempt them from normal market constraints. The Fed's own rhetoric reveals the logical contradictions in their approach. They simultaneously claim to fight inflation while pursuing policies explicitly designed to create it. The Fed's target of 2% inflation acknowledges their intention to continually diminish the purchasing power of American currency. They present this systematic monetary destruction as evidence of successful economic management. Central bank officials speak of monetary accommodation, quantitative easing, and stimulus as if these euphemisms could change the essential nature of their actions. Whether they call it asset purchases or credit expansion, the Federal Reserve is creating new money that didn't previously exist and injecting it into the economy. The linguistic sophistication cannot alter the logical consequences of increasing the money supply. The Fed's dual mandate, pursuing both full employment and price stability, reveals another fundamental contradiction. These goals are mutually incompatible when pursued through monetary policy. Attempts to increase employment through credit expansion necessarily create inflation by lowering interest rates artificially and encouraging excessive borrowing. Conversely, genuine price stability requires stable money supply growth that may not accommodate politically desired employment levels. This contradiction forces the Fed into a continuous cycle of monetary expansion followed by attempts to control the inflation this expansion creates. When inflation accelerates beyond their target range, they raise interest rates and reduce money growth. triggering the recession that reveals the malinvestments created during the expansion phase. Then, facing political pressure to address unemployment, they resume monetary expansion, beginning the cycle anew. The 2008 financial crisis perfectly illustrated this dynamic. The Fed's policies of keeping interest rates artificially low throughout the early 2000s fueled the housing bubble by making mortgage credit artificially cheap. When this bubble inevitably burst, the Fed responded not by acknowledging their role in creating the crisis, but by expanding monetary policy even more dramatically through quantitative easing programs. These emergency measures became permanent features of Fed policy, demonstrating how each intervention necessitates further interventions. Having created massive distortions through artificial credit expansion, the Fed now claims these distortions require perpetual monetary accommodation to prevent economic collapse. The Fed's communication strategy compounds these problems by attempting to manage market expectations through forward guidance and other verbal interventions. They believe they can influence economic outcomes by promising future monetary policies, as if economic reality could be controlled through carefully crafted public statements. This approach treats market participants as if they were passive recipients of Fed communications rather than active individuals making decisions based on their own analysis of economic conditions. When Fed officials announced their intentions to maintain low interest rates, entrepreneurs and investors must still make actual decisions about real investments using real resources. The Fed's verbal promises cannot alter the underlying economic logic that determines whether these investments will prove profitable. The institutional structure of central banking creates systematic incentives for monetary expansion regardless of economic consequences. Fed officials face political pressure to stimulate economic activity during recessions and enjoy no corresponding pressure to maintain monetary restraint during boom periods. The benefits of monetary expansion appear immediately in economic statistics, while the costs manifest as inflation and malinvestment that emerge gradually over time. Chapter 5: The Inflation Tax: How Government Finances Itself Through Monetary Debasement. Inflation serves as the most insidious form of taxation because it operates invisibly, requires no legislative approval, and falls disproportionately on those least able to protect themselves. Understanding inflation as taxation reveals why governments consistently choose monetary expansion over honest financing methods. When government spends money it doesn't possess, it faces three basic options: raise taxes explicitly, borrow from willing lenders, or create new money. The first option faces obvious political resistance, as citizens can see and resist direct taxation. The second option requires government to offer attractive terms to voluntary lenders, limiting how much can be borrowed. The third option, monetary creation, appears to avoid these constraints while providing immediate spending power. Inflation represents taxation without representation in its purest form. When the Federal Reserve creates new money to purchase government bonds, it enables government spending without explicit congressional appropriation of these funds. The government receives immediate purchasing power while the costs are distributed invisibly across all money holders through reduced purchasing power. This process operates exactly like taxation but without the political transparency that accompanies normal tax collection. Citizens see their money buying less but cannot directly connect this loss to specific government expenditures. The inflation tax appears as mysterious economic forces rather than deliberate government policy, making political resistance more difficult. The distributional effects of inflation taxation are profoundly regressive. Wealthy individuals can protect themselves through asset ownership, foreign currency holdings, and investments that appreciate during inflationary periods. They often benefit from inflation by borrowing money at artificially low interest rates and repaying these loans with depreciated currency. Working families and retirees cannot access these protective mechanisms. They hold most of their wealth in currency and bank deposits that lose purchasing power directly through inflation. Their wages typically adjust slowly to price increases, creating periods where their real income declines substantially. Fixed-income retirees suffer most severely, as their pension payments buy steadily less while their ability to adjust their income remains limited. Observe this in current American economic conditions. While stock markets and real estate prices have soared during periods of aggressive Federal Reserve monetary expansion, wages for ordinary workers have stagnated or declined in real terms. This represents a massive transfer of wealth from wage earners to asset owners, accomplished through monetary policy rather than explicit legislation. The inflation tax also penalizes saving while rewarding borrowing, fundamentally altering the incentive structure that promotes capital accumulation and economic growth. When inflation consistently erodes the value of money, individuals rationally choose immediate consumption over saving for future needs. This destroys the voluntary saving that provides the foundation for investment and economic progress. Government benefits enormously from this distorted incentive structure. As the largest debtor in the economy, government sees its debt burden reduced through inflation while its ability to finance new spending through money creation remains unlimited. The same inflation that destroys private savings makes government debt more manageable by enabling repayment with depreciated currency. The Federal Reserve's current balance sheet demonstrates the magnitude of this hidden taxation. Through quantitative easing programs, the Fed has purchased trillions of dollars in government bonds with newly created money. This represents the purest form of government finance through money printing. Yet it operates without explicit congressional authorization and without public understanding of its true nature. Modern governments have become addicted to inflation finance precisely because it avoids the political costs of honest taxation. When politicians promise extensive government programs without corresponding tax increases, they implicitly rely on monetary financing to bridge the gap between spending promises and revenue reality. The Federal Reserve enables this fiscal irresponsibility by purchasing government debt with newly created money. This relationship explains why central bank independence is largely illusory. Despite formal institutional separation, central banks face enormous political pressure to accommodate government financing needs through monetary expansion. The Fed's current policies of maintaining artificially low interest rates and purchasing government bonds serve primarily to reduce government borrowing costs rather than achieve any legitimate monetary policy objective. The inflation tax operates with particular severity during times of crisis when government spending accelerates rapidly. The recent response to economic lockdowns illustrates this dynamic perfectly. Government promised trillions in spending for various relief programs while the Federal Reserve simultaneously expanded the money supply at unprecedented rates to accommodate this spending. Citizens received direct government payments while simultaneously facing increased prices for food, energy, housing, and other essential goods. The apparent benefits of government spending were immediate and visible, while the costs of inflation emerged gradually and appeared disconnected from government policy decisions. Chapter 6: Why Sound Money is Essential for Economic Calculation. Economic calculation, the ability of entrepreneurs to determine which productive activities create value and which destroy it, depends entirely on stable monetary units that reflect genuine market conditions. Without sound money, the price system cannot perform its essential function of coordinating economic activity across complex modern economies. Every entrepreneurial decision requires comparing costs and revenues to determine profitability. When an entrepreneur considers whether to build a factory, hire additional workers, or develop a new product, he must calculate whether the expected revenues will exceed the costs involved. This calculation becomes possible only when both costs and revenues are expressed in monetary units that maintain stable purchasing power over time. Inflation destroys the reliability of these calculations by introducing arbitrary changes in the monetary unit itself. When prices rise due to monetary expansion rather than changes in underlying supply and demand conditions, Entrepreneurs cannot distinguish between price movements reflecting genuine economic signals and those resulting from monetary manipulation. Consider a restaurant owner observing increased demand for his meals. Does this increase reflect genuine consumer preference changes that justify expanding his business, or does it simply reflect customers spending newly created money before prices adjust fully? Under inflationary conditions, the entrepreneur cannot answer this question reliably because the monetary unit itself is changing unpredictably. The Austrian theory of the business cycle explains how this breakdown in economic calculation creates systematic malinvestment throughout the economy. When central banks lower interest rates artificially through credit expansion, they signal to entrepreneurs that consumers are saving more and demanding fewer present goods. Acting on this false signal, entrepreneurs begin long-term investment projects that appear profitable only because of the artificially cheap credit. The resulting malinvestments reveal themselves when the monetary expansion slows or stops. Projects that seemed profitable under artificially low interest rates cannot generate sufficient revenue to justify their costs when interest rates return to market levels. The entrepreneurs who made these calculations in good faith find their businesses failing not because of any error in economic logic, but because the monetary signals on which they relied were systematically distorted. This process explains why inflationary booms always end in economic busts. The boom represents a period of systematic miscalculation caused by distorted monetary signals, while the bust represents the necessary correction when economic reality reasserts itself. The greater the monetary distortion during the boom phase, the more severe the subsequent correction must be. Sound money provides the stable measuring rod necessary for accurate economic calculation. Just as physical measurement requires stable units like meters or pounds, economic measurement requires monetary units that maintain consistent purchasing power. When the monetary unit changes unpredictably, economic calculation becomes as impossible as engineering would be if the meter changed length randomly. Historical experience demonstrates the superiority of sound money systems for economic coordination. During the classical gold standard period from 1879 to 1914, the United States experienced remarkable economic growth with minimal inflation. Entrepreneurs could make long-term calculations with confidence because they knew the dollar would maintain its purchasing power over extended periods. The price level remained essentially stable over decades, allowing businesses to enter into long-term contracts without fear of monetary depreciation. Workers could save money knowing their accumulated wealth would retain its value. The absence of systematic inflation eliminated the need for complex financial instruments designed to hedge against monetary depreciation. Modern economies have lost these advantages through the adoption of managed fiat currencies. Instead of providing a stable measuring rod for economic calculation, central banks deliberately manipulate money to achieve various policy objectives. This manipulation necessarily distorts the price signals on which economic coordination depends. The complexity of modern financial markets reflects, in large part, the difficulty of conducting business under unstable monetary conditions. When entrepreneurs cannot rely on stable money, they must develop sophisticated hedging strategies, complex derivatives, and elaborate risk management systems simply to protect themselves from monetary uncertainty. These protective mechanisms represent pure waste from society's perspective. The resources devoted to hedging against inflation and managing monetary risk could be employed productively if the monetary system provided genuine stability. Sound money would eliminate most of this financial complexity by removing the monetary uncertainty that necessitates these elaborate protective measures. The Federal Reserve's current policies make economic calculation increasingly difficult by creating massive uncertainty about future monetary conditions. When the Fed can change interest rates dramatically based on political considerations or economic theories, entrepreneurs cannot make reliable long-term plans. The resulting uncertainty discourages the long-term investment that drives economic progress. Free market money would emerge naturally from competitive processes, just as market-based standards emerge for other goods and services. Without government monopoly over money creation, competing currencies would develop reputations for stability and reliability. Citizens could choose the monetary systems that best serve their needs, creating market incentives for sound money practices. Chapter 7: The Only Solution: Returning to Market-Based Money. The solution to inflation is neither complex monetary rules nor sophisticated central bank policies. It is the complete elimination of government monopoly over money creation. Only by returning to market-based monetary systems can we restore the sound money foundation necessary for economic prosperity. Free market money would emerge through the same competitive processes that provide excellence in all other goods and services. Without legal tender laws forcing acceptance of government currencies, competing monetary systems would develop based on their ability to maintain stable purchasing power and facilitate economic exchange. History demonstrates how market-based money naturally tends toward stability and reliability. Before government monopolization of money creation, private banks competed by offering currencies backed by gold, silver, or other valuable commodities. Banks that issued excessive currency faced immediate market discipline as customers demanded redemption in specie, forcing responsible monetary practices. The classical gold standard represented the closest historical approximation to free market money, though it still involved significant government intervention. Even this imperfect system provided far greater monetary stability than modern central banking. During gold standard periods, long-term price levels remained remarkably stable, enabling accurate economic calculation and encouraging long-term saving and investment. Modern technology makes truly competitive monetary systems more feasible than ever before. Digital currencies, cryptocurrency platforms, and sophisticated payment systems could facilitate multiple competing monies without the practical difficulties that historically limited monetary competition. Citizens could choose between various monetary options based on their stability, convenience, and reliability. The transition to market-based money requires eliminating the legal privileges that maintain central bank monopolies. Legal tender laws force acceptance of government currencies regardless of their quality or stability. Removing these laws would allow market participants to choose whatever monetary media best serve their needs. Banking regulations that prohibit currency competition must also be eliminated. Current laws make it illegal for private institutions to issue currencies or provide banking services without government approval. These regulations protect central bank monopolies by preventing market alternatives from developing. The benefits of monetary competition would extend far beyond price stability. Competing monetary systems would develop innovative features to attract customers, just as competing businesses innovate in other industries. Some currencies might emphasize maximum stability, others might offer enhanced privacy protection, and still others might provide superior convenience for international transactions. Market discipline would eliminate the systematic bias toward inflation that characterizes government monetary systems. Private monetary institutions that depreciated their currencies would lose customers to more reliable competitors. Unlike central banks, which face no market consequences for poor performance, competitive money providers would succeed only by maintaining customer confidence through responsible practices. The Austrian approach recognizes that monetary policy represents central planning applied to the most fundamental economic institution. Just as central planning fails in other industries, it inevitably fails in money creation. No central authority possesses the knowledge necessary to determine optimal money supply growth or appropriate interest rate levels for complex economies. Free market processes would coordinate monetary supply with genuine economic demand through voluntary exchange rather than bureaucratic decree. When individuals and businesses needed additional monetary media for expanding economic activity, profitable opportunities would emerge for monetary entrepreneurs to supply this demand. When monetary demand decreased, market forces would naturally reduce monetary supply without government intervention. Critics argue that competitive money would create chaos and uncertainty, but this concern reflects confusion about the difference between genuine stability and artificial government controls. Current monetary systems create massive uncertainty through unpredictable central bank policies, arbitrary policy changes, and systematic inflation that destroys economic calculation. Market-based money would provide genuine stability based on underlying economic value rather than political promises. Citizens could choose monetary systems that matched their preference for stability versus convenience, privacy versus transparency, or local versus international acceptability. The transition period would require careful attention to maintaining economic stability while dismantling government monetary monopolies. Gradual elimination of central bank privileges, combined with protection for emerging competitive monetary systems, could facilitate smooth adjustment to market-based money. Educational efforts must accompany these institutional changes. Citizens accustomed to government money need to understand how market-based alternatives would function and why competitive money systems provide superior stability and reliability. Only through widespread understanding of sound money principles can we build political support for the necessary reforms. The restoration of sound money represents perhaps the most important economic reform America could undertake. Without stable money, free markets cannot function effectively. Economic calculation becomes impossible, and the systematic wealth transfers enabled by inflation continue undermining social cooperation and economic progress. The choice before us is clear: continue accepting the inflation tax and economic instability created by central bank monopolies, or restore the monetary freedom that enabled unprecedented prosperity in America's past. The principles of Austrian economics provide the roadmap for this restoration, but implementation requires citizens who understand the crucial importance of sound money for human freedom and economic prosperity. Conclusion. The failure of mainstream economists to understand inflation stems from their refusal to acknowledge that economics is a logical science rather than a branch of politics or social engineering. Their complex mathematical models and sophisticated statistical analyses cannot overcome the fundamental error of treating monetary phenomena as if they existed independently of human action and choice. Inflation will continue destroying American prosperity as long as we maintain the illusion that central banks can manage economic outcomes through monetary manipulation. The Federal Reserve's promises of price stability and full employment represent logical impossibilities that no amount of technical sophistication can achieve. The praxeological understanding of inflation offers more than theoretical clarity. It provides the foundation for practical solutions based on market processes rather than government control. By returning to competitive monetary systems and eliminating central bank monopolies, America could restore the sound money foundation that enabled unprecedented economic growth in our past. The choice is ours, but time is not unlimited. Each day of continued monetary manipulation adds to the distortions accumulating throughout our economy. The longer we delay returning to sound money principles, the more severe the necessary corrections will become. Economic truth eventually prevails over political expedience. But the transition can be either gradual and planned or sudden and catastrophic. By choosing to understand and apply correct monetary principles now, we can guide America toward genuine prosperity based on voluntary cooperation rather than continued wealth transfers through the inflation tax. The logic of human action demands sound money. The future of American freedom depends on our willingness to implement this logical necessity despite political resistance from those who benefit from current monetary privileges.